The town sat on the edge of nothing, dust blown flat against the boards, a half-frozen wind cutting through the alleyways like it had a grudge. Marin rode in just after noon, her mule slow, ribs visible beneath the woolen saddle blanket, wore a long gray shawl patched in 3 places, and a dark skirt stiff from old rain. Her boots were cracked. Her hands stayed wrapped around the reins like she was afraid even those would leave her. She didn't glance at the church, didn't pause near the store. Her eyes stayed ahead, fixed on the wooden front of the saloon where heedless laughter drifted out like smoke from a rotten chimney. That's when she saw them. 2 boys. One smaller, curled tight like a kicked dog. The other stood hunched, head down, arms chained to the thick hitching post outside the saloon like livestock. Their coats were gone. One wore a shirt torn open at the shoulder. The other had only a burlap sack cut for sleeves. Bare feet, ashes-smudged cheeks. No one looked at them. A man on a stool nearby sipped something brown from a tin cup. Didn't blink. A drunk stumbled by, nearly tripping over the smaller boy, muttered a curse, then laughed like it was a show. Marin stopped her mule and sat there for a moment. The wind tugging at her shawl inside, the saloon smelled of spilled liquor and boiled pork. The man behind the bar had one eye milky, the other sharp as flint. He looked up slow, took her in. Without standing, "Don't got coffee this week," he said. "Flowers all weevils." She didn't speak. He squinted. "You from the gulch?" Still, she said nothing. Her eyes slid to the side, toward the window that framed the street. And the boys outside. The barkeep followed her gaze. Caught him lifting jerky 2 days back. "Don't belong to nobody. Guess they're mine now." Silence. $1 apiece, he added with a grin. "Steal 'em or save 'em. Either way, they ain't cheap." "Ada." Marin reached into the pocket. Inside her coat and placed $2 silver on the wood. Not gently, not angrily, just like that. Laid them down. The barkeep stared. "You serious?" She turned and walked out. Back on the street, the older boy looked up, just barely. His eyes were green under the grime, pale and hollow. The younger didn't move. Marin untied the iron clasp holding the chains, letting them drop in the dust. The clink sounded louder than the wind. She picked up the smaller one, light as an old quilt, and placed him across the saddle in front of her. The older boy stood there, unsure. "You walk," she said, her voice dry from disuse. "Don't fall behind." Just like that, she turned the mule south, toward the broken fence line and cracked earth of what used to be home. No one stopped her. No one cared. The saloon door creaked once behind her. Someone might have watched, or maybe they just turned back to their drink. The town grew small behind them, its wooden frames shrinking like bones in a fire. Dust rose in their wake, kicked up by hooves and bare feet. The mule trudged forward, slow and steady. Marin didn't look back. The boy walked beside her in silence, feet red from the cold, never once asking where they were going. The younger one coughed once, then went quiet. Marin's shawl fluttered in the wind, and she reached down to cover the child's back as best she could. She didn't know their names, didn't ask. The road was long, and she'd ridden it alone for too many years, but something had shifted. When she saw them there, chained like dogs, forgotten like wood too green to burn, a woman who had nothing had paid a price. Not for mercy, not for sainthood. Just for the sound the chains made when they hit the ground. It would take a long time for her to understand what she had done. For now, she rode on, the wind behind them, silence between them, and the long gray road ahead. The land grew quieter the farther they traveled. Not peaceful, just empty. The wind softened, but the cold stayed sharp, like breath held too long. By the time the mule crested the last rise, the sun had dropped low enough to stain the valley. In rust and smoke, the homestead stood crooked in the half-light. One room still stood, barely. The other, once a kitchen or a bedroom, had caved in from snow years back. The roof sagged in places, patched with canvas and nailed-up feed sacks. A crooked fence leaned around the yard, its posts frostbitten and split. There were no chickens. No dogs, no horses. just the bones of what had once been a life. Marin slid off the mule and lifted the younger boy from the saddle without a word. His head lolled against her shoulder, but he didn't speak. The older one stood nearby, bare feet shifting on the frozen ground. Eyes darting like a stray's, she opened the door and let the stove's weak heat out into the dusk. Inside, the walls were bare. A small table leaned in one corner, a cracked enamel bowl resting on top. A rocking chair sat near the stove, unmoving. On the far wall, someone had tacked up an old quilt with rusty nails to block the wind. A thin mattress lay rolled against the far end of the room, and a dented tin coffee pot rested near the coals. Marin set the boy down gently and reached for kindling. She didn't tell them to sit, didn't ask them to speak. She just built up the fire and poured a bit of water from a cracked jug into the kettle. Her fingers moved without thought, out of habit, not hope. The boys stayed near the heat, huddled together like coals that only knew how to cling. She found a piece of stale cornbread wrapped in a cloth and broke it in half, laying it near. Then, without a word, the older one sniffed it, then split it again to give the smaller half to his brother. They ate in silence. That night, as the wind moaned through the chimney and sleet tapped the tin roof like bones, Marin sat by the fire, watching shadows stretch and shrink. She didn't light a lantern, just stared into the orange flicker while the boys drifted into sleep. The older one curled around the little one like a shield, his arms slung protectively across the boy's chest. Their breathing was soft and uncertain, like they didn't trust it would last till morning. Marin's eyes drifted to the door that led into the collapsed part of the house. It had once been a nursery, though she'd stopped calling it that. The door stayed shut, warped now at the hinges, half buried in dirt. Somewhere in that room were a pair of wooden toys her husband carved during the war, a single dress folded neatly in a pine chest, and a horseshoe they never nailed above the cradle. The grave under the cottonwood out back was marked with the same rusted iron, bent from age. She hadn't gone in there in 4 winters. Outside, the wind howled like it remembered something. Inside, the fire shrank low. Moran didn't cry. Her grief was older than tears, hard and dry like driftwood. Still, when she closed her eyes, she heard it. Not the boys, not the storm. A baby, crying from the other room, not loud but real. It came in waves, just like it used to. She sat up in the rocker, fingers wrapped around the arms of the chair until her knuckles whitened. The crying faded, dissolved into the crackling stove. She waited a long while before breathing again. Morning came thin and colorless. Moran stepped outside to gather water from the well, only to find it dry again. She stood there with the bucket in hand, staring down into the dark. A hawk cried overhead. When she came back in, the older boy was sweeping ashes back into the stovepan with his sleeve. He didn't look at her, but the movement was careful, precise. His brother still slept, hands clutching the edge of the quilt like it might vanish. She hung a second quilt on the opposite wall to trap the warmth, then patched the window with canvas and tallow wax. The boys watched her, but said nothing. When the wind picked up again in the afternoon, it didn't cut quite so deep, she found. 2 old shirts her husband once wore, one with the elbows gone, the other stained with oil. They hung loose on the boys' thin frames, but it was better than rags. She left them on the table. When she returned from the woodshed, the shirts were gone and the boys were back by the fire. She wondered how long it had been since anyone had given them something without taking something first. Later, she brewed a tin cup of weak coffee and sat in the rocker, watching smoke curl in lazy tendrils toward the ceiling. The older boy began tracing something in the ash along the hearthstone. Circles, then lines, then what looked like a letter. His hand shook. She didn't say a word. Outside, the snow started again, light at first, then heavy, each flake thick, as cotton and just as silent. Marin stared out the window, arms crossed, and thought about names she hadn't spoken in years. Names she might never speak again. The boys didn't ask where they were, didn't ask why she took them. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe they'd learned that asking brought nothing but lies. Marin didn't push. She let the quiet do what it is. Does best, fill the space between strangers with something softer than words. Something like survival. Something like beginning. Ask ChatGPT. The storm rolled in fast, like the land itself had grown tired of waiting. By mid-morning, the air was heavy with warning. Sky the color of worn pewter, wind carrying the scent of something more than cold. Snowflakes began as whispers, then came in with the weight of fists. Maren stood at the window, arms crossed over her chest, eyes locked on the dark swell beyond the hills. There was little wood left. It's not enough for another night, not if the wind kept screaming like that. She pulled her shawl tight, took down the old hatchet from its peg, and strapped it to her saddle. The boys watched from the fire, eyes flicking. To her, then to the door. She didn't explain, just looked to the older one, then to the stove. "Keep it fed," she said. He nodded, serious as a soldier. The mule balked against the wind, but she pushed forward into the canyon. The air grew, thick and white, muffling everything, swallowing hoofbeats and breath. Dead trees leaned like bones waiting to fall. She found a half-rotten log lodged beneath a rock outcrop, enough to last a few days if she split it right. Her hands moved fast, swinging the blade in rhythm, breath fogging the air with each grunt. She didn't hear the footsteps, not her own, and not the ones that followed. By the time she turned back, her tracks were already half-buried. She glanced behind once, then again, narrow boot prints alongside her own, lighter and straighter. Someone had been watching. Someone had walked behind her. She gripped the hatchet tighter, but saw no one. Dust clung to the land by the time she made it home. The wind had nearly knocked the barn door off its hinges. Smoke curled gently from behind it that stopped her. She dropped the woodpile outside the door and stepped toward the barn with the hatchet still in her hand. Inside, the boys were sitting by a small fire, not the one in the house, but a new one, crackling low in the barn's stone hearth. They weren't afraid, just quiet. Between them stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a fur-lined coat that had seen better winters. His face was lined, his eyes dark and steady. His hair was pulled back in a braid tied with leather. His skin, the color of river earth, carried old sun and older stories. He turned when she entered, didn't flinch, just nodded once. "Maren," he said, voice low as distant thunder. She didn't lower the hatchet. "Tall Wolf." He nodded again, slower this time. "Saw your mule tracks. Saw the boys. Thought maybe it was time." The last time she'd seen him, her husband was still alive. They'd fought in the same regiment, her husband a Union scout, Tall Wolf, a tracker who never said more than necessary. She'd heard whispers that Tall Wolf had gone north, that he'd married, lost a child, been chased off by settlers, and now here he stood in her barn, by her fire, with her ghosts. The boys didn't speak. The younger one looked up at Tall Wolf with wide eyes, unmoving. The older stayed alert, but not afraid. There was something about the man that didn't ask for trust, just carried it like a story worn smooth by time. He held up a rabbit, skinned and gutted. "For the pot," he said. She didn't reply, only gave a stiff nod and stepped aside. The hatchet stayed in her grip a moment longer before she slid it into the wood bin. She turned to the children, back inside. "Let go." They obeyed without question, trailing into the house like shadows. The door creaked shut behind them. Waited. Tall Wolf stayed still. "Why now?" she asked, voice rasped by wind and silence. "I heard about your man. Heard you were alone. Then I saw the boys." He looked to the door. "Didn't know you still had fire left in you?" She stared at him, eyes unreadable. "I don't." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe they do." That night he stayed near. The hearth, back to the door, shoulders relaxed but ready. The boys curled near the fire, both wearing the shirts she'd given them. The stew pot bubbled low. Maren sat in the rocker, shawl pulled tight, watching them all like she might lose them any second. Tall Wolf sat cross-legged on the floor, the younger boy in his lap. With quiet patience, he combed his fingers through the boy's tangled hair, then began to braid it. Not tight, not for show, but with care. A protective braid, the kind meant to say, "You are not alone anymore." The older boy watched closely, hands folded in his lap. Moran didn't speak. Neither did the stranger. Outside, the storm wailed like a thing abandoned. Snow piled high against the windows. The wind rattled the frame, but inside, the fire held strong. The silence between them, the woman with her ghosts, the stranger with his past, and the boys with their unspoken wounds, was not empty. It was something else. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something beginning, asked ChatGPT. The storm did not leave. It stayed the way old wounds stay heavy, silent, always threatening to open again. Day after day, the wind scraped against the cabin like it was trying to peel the boards back. Snow piled against the doorframe, sealed. The windows in a crust of frost. Inside, they shared the same air, the same fire, and little else. Tall Wolf took to sleeping near the door. His bedroll always rolled tight and set in reach. Didn't speak much unless spoken to, and even then, his words came slow, deliberate. He listened more than he talked, to the creak of the rafters, the boys breathing the wind. His presence filled the space like old timber, not decorative, not warm, but strong and necessary. Marin didn't ask why he stayed. She stirred the pot, handed him firewood, patched the crack in the window with more canvas. They worked side by side in silence, never touching, rarely locking eyes, but somehow in rhythm. He split kindling. She cleaned out the ash. The boy sat close by, drawing warmth from more than the stove. The older one began to whisper at first. It was only when he thought she wasn't listening short words to his brother. Questions asked so quietly the wind could carry them away. But she noticed. And when she caught him tracing letters in the dust with a fingertip, H, then O, then a crooked M, she brought him a stub of charcoal and an old flour sack to write on. "Home," she said. He looked up at her, eyes wide, uncertain. Then, nodded, the younger one started humming. A melody with no words, just a rhythm that made the room feel rounder, softer. Wasn't a lullaby, Marin knew, but it twisted something in her chest. It came mostly at night, when the fire dimmed and the shadows deepened across the walls. Outside, the world festered. On the third day, hooves broke the silence. Marin was at the window when they came, 3 men on horseback, their silhouettes blurred by snow. One rode ahead of the others, broad-shouldered, his hat low over his brow. She didn't need to see his face to know it was the saloon keeper. Tall Wolf was already standing, blade in hand, silent. The riders stopped at the gate. One spat into the snow. The saloon keeper leaned on his saddle horn, shouted loud enough too. "Carrie, you've got something of mine, widow." She didn't move. Neither did Tall Wolf. "You think buying him off me means you can keep him?" he continued. "Paper says they're property? Orphans got no claim. That's the law now. They run their thieves. You hide him, you're worse." Still she didn't speak. Inside, the boys huddled together. Tall Wolf stood between them and the door. "I'll be back with the sheriff," the saloon keeper warned, then turned his horse and rode off. The others followed. Snow closed behind them like they'd never been that night. The cabin felt smaller. The fire hissed and cracked, but it did not warm them the same. Tall Wolf sat by the door, sharpening a broken blade with a whetstone, the rhythm steady, metallic. Sparks danced at the edge of the lantern glow. Marin sat in the rocker, her late husband's rifle resting across her lap. She hadn't touched it in months. Tonight her hands moved with old certainty, checking the chamber, wiping the stock, cleaning rust from the barrel. The rifle had once defended a family. It still might. The boys didn't ask questions. They watched with eyes too old for their faces. Wide and knowing like they'd seen this before. Maybe not this house. Maybe not these people. But this feeling that the world could knock any second and everything soft would break. Outside, the snow thickened again, muffling hoofbeats, silencing roads. No one came, not that night. But the fire stayed lit till morning. The thaw came slow, not like spring, but like something buried too long clawing its way to the surface. Days passed where the snow no longer fell but lingered, melting in long drips from the porch edge. Ice sloughed off in sheets, cracking loud. Against the steps, land began to smell like itself again. Earth, rot, old wood, smoke. The morning it changed, the light came through the window with a softer color. Moran stepped outside, her boots crunching through half-melted frost, and found Tall Wolf standing beside the barn, staring at the roofline. He didn't speak when she came up beside him, just pointed with his chin to the sagging beam. Won't hold through another storm. She looked up, nodded. We'll need new braces, and stone, if we can find it dry. She didn't ask why, he said we, just rolled up her sleeves. They worked. Side by side, day by day, pulling rot from the foundation, dragging split logs from the pile near the ravine. Her hands blistered beneath her gloves.
Hey.
His knuckles cracked from the cold. He showed her how to place the support beams using only leverage and rope. She showed him where the wood still held true beneath the decay. They didn't speak much. When they did, it wasn't to fill space, only to shape it. The boys trailed them, sometimes helping, sometimes playing in the patches of dirt and broken snow. Once, the younger one chased after a chicken that had escaped the coop, laughing as it flapped across the yard. The older boy watched, then laughed too, a sudden startled sound, as if he didn't know he still could. Marin paused when she heard it, just for a second. That night, the wind softened. The house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. She laid the boys down near the fire, covered them with quilts, and stepped out into the barn. The new beams were rough, but solid. The walls no longer moaned in the wind. Tall Wolf was sitting on a bale of straw, whittling something from cedar. His hands moved slow, careful. She didn't speak, just sat across from him, rubbing her raw palms. The silence felt different now. Not empty, full. The next morning, while searching the back of the closet for a bit of thread, Marin found the old trunk. She hesitated before opening it. The hinges creaked like a warning. Inside, beneath folded shirts and a rusted belt buckle, was her husband's wedding vest, dark blue, faded along the seams, buttons still missing from where she'd clutched. Then once in grief, she lifted it gently, smoothed the cloth with her fingers, then walked outside, past the boys, past the barn, and into the yard.
You're in the yard.
The fire in the stove was strong. She opened it, laid the vest inside, and shut the door. It took quickly. The fabric curled and blackened, buttons turning red-hot before vanishing in a hiss. She didn't cry. She didn't blink. She stood with her hands at her sides until the flame settled down. Tall Wolf watched from the threshold. Elle said nothing. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep and the wind had stilled, he handed her something wrapped in cloth. She opened it slowly. A carving, simple but careful. A woman, 2 children, one on each side, their hands joined, not polished, not perfect, but real. She looked up at him. He didn't speak, didn't offer explanation, just waited. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing his hand, calloused, cracked, warm. He didn't move. The fire didn't leap or roar. It burned steady, low, and sure. The kind that stays even after the world's gone cold. The snow had long since turned to mud, and the road into town wore deep with ruts. But Marin knew the sound of trouble before it ever reached the gate. The wind had gone still again, not soft, but silent in a way that made the crows stop calling, and the mule twitch its ears. She stepped outside just as 3 riders crested the ridge. The sheriff rode first, stiff in the saddle, his badge dulled with age. Behind him came the saloon keeper, mouth already working around words he couldn't wait to spit. The third man was a deputy Marin didn't recognize, younger, but with the same tight jaw and pale fingers wrapped around a holstered pistol. They stopped a few yards from the house. The sheriff called her name, Marin Hargrove. She didn't flinch, just waited, her shawl drawn close, hands at her sides. The saloon keeper raised his voice, sharp like a blade drawn quick. She took what ain't hers. Those boys, they were chained, she said flatly. Starving. Still don't make 'em hers, he spat. We got papers. Orphans are town property, board of the state. The sheriff held up a folded document, yellowed and crinkled at the edges. Law's the law, he said, but his voice didn't carry heat, just weariness. Tall Wolf stepped onto the porch, calm as ever, arms crossed over his chest. The older boy stood just behind the doorframe, watching. The younger clung to the edge of a blanket, silent. Marin reached into her coat and pulled out a page, folded once, worn at the crease. She walked forward slowly and handed it to the sheriff. He unfolded it, read, then read again. The handwriting was her husband's, stiff, slanted, ink-faded. With time, the date etched along the bottom reached back 5 winters. A will of sorts, written before the fever took him. It was simple, a declaration. One line stood out, underlined in pencil. I leave what remains of my land and name to Marin, and charge her with the keeping of the weak, the unwanted and the forgotten, as she once did for me. The sheriff's fingers tightened around the page, his eyes lifted slowly to meet hers. I served with a man like that, he murmured, almost to himself. Didn't smile much, but he never turned his back. He folded the paper and handed it back. His boots shifted in the mud. Then he turned his horse without a word. The deputy followed. The saloon keeper stayed a moment longer, his face souring like curdled milk.
I'll do.
Then he, too, wheeled around and rode off without another word. Marin didn't watch them go. That afternoon they packed. Tall Wolf loaded supplies into the wagon, flour, dried beans, cured meat, thread, a new coil of rope. He tied the boys' things into bundles, not much, just clean shirts, a worn book, the wooden carving he'd made. The younger boy held it like it was something sacred. The older one helped harness the mule, mimicking Tall Wolf's motions, glancing at Marin for approval. She didn't speak, just rested her hand on his shoulder for a breath longer than necessary. When everything was ready, the boys climbed into the wagon. They sat taller now, cleaner, their eyes steadier. Their wounds hadn't vanished, but something else had taken root beneath them. Marin walked around to the side and took the reins. She looked up at Tall Wolf. Where to? He gave a quiet shrug. But there was a warmth behind his stillness. Anywhere with Sky? They rolled out slow, wheels creaking under the weight. The road was softer now, the ice gone, the trees dripping meltwater like tears they'd been holding too long. When they reached the town's edge, a few people stepped out to watch. Some stared, cold and wordless. One man spat in the dirt. An old woman across the way lowered her head in a quiet nod. A child waved, then ducked behind a barrel. Marin didn't return any of it. Her eyes stayed forward. Behind them lay a graveyard of silence, of names not spoken, of lives not counted. Ahead was only more road and something like sky. By mid-morning, the town had vanished behind the hills. The wagon creaked in rhythm with the mule's steady pace. The younger boy leaned against his brother, eyes half-closed in the sunlight. Tall Wolf walked beside the wagon, not speaking, not hurrying. Marin held the reins with one hand, the other resting lightly on her lap. Far in the distance, smoke rose from a chimney, thin and straight, curling into the blue like a ribbon. A homestead. She didn't know who lived there. Maybe no one. But she nodded once, not to it. To the road, the day, the fact that she'd kept something alive. The journey was not over. But it had begun. Ask ChatGPT.